This tutorial is sponsored by Envato Elements. Hi everyone and welcome to another photo manipulation tutorial on my channel. Today we'll go through the process of turning a bunch of stock images and graphic elements into an imaginary scene. And by the way, I make a mixture of editing, VFX and Photoshop tutorials. So if you enjoy this type of videos, don't forget to hit the sub button. And now let's get into the video. The first thing we need to do after launching Adobe Photoshop is create a new document. I usually go with this resolution since it's pretty suitable for Instagram feed, but feel free to go with your own choice here. As usual, if you wish to follow the process, you can find all the original assets used in this video in the description box below. Let's import the first stock image. I want to enlarge this to be able to see the burning mountains a bit up close. Rename this to land. Since this is supposed to be far in the distance, let's add a lens or Gaussian blur. Set the radius to 6 or so. Right above it, let's bring over this sky image which I found on Unsplash, give it a proper name, add a layer mask, and with the mask selected, change to the brush tool, change the foreground color to black. This way we can use the brush as an eraser, scale it up, keep the hardness close to 0%, and simply erase the bottom half of the sky photo in order to achieve a better blend with the existing sky that's right below it. Obviously the color still doesn't match that well, so let's add an exposure layer, create a clipping mask to make sure it only affects the layer that comes directly below it. Bring the exposure down, adjust both offset and gamma. Let's go back to the night sky image real quick and add a Gaussian blur filter here as well. We can reduce the radius to 2 or so. We still need to work on establishing the overall look and feel of the background. So all the way on top, let's add a new curves layer, adjust the curve into an S shape to add some contrast. Alright, now let's select all these background layers. Click here to group them into one folder and keep our project organized. Let's call this BG for background. And now we can focus on the foreground. Drag and drop the C image, scale it up, rename the layer. I want to get rid of the sky here, so add the layer mask, make sure it's selected, and simply erase the sky. You can also use the magic wand tool here for a quicker selection, but I know for sure that I'll need to refine the edges anyway, so I find it easier to use the brush straight away. Let's slide the layer down a bit and continue cleaning the edges around the horizon here. It looks good so far. We do have a massive fire far in the horizon, so that should naturally affect the color of the water. To showcase that, let's duplicate the layer by pressing Ctrl J on your keyboard. Let's rename this to Sea Orange. Press Ctrl U to pull up hue saturation properties. Adjust both hue and saturation. Change the blend mode to hard light. Now I don't want the orange tint to reach the foreground all the way, so select the layer mask. Bring the opacity of the brush down to 40% and simply get rid of some of the orange effect around the foreground section. I think that looks pretty good. The orange portion of the water is also far in the distance and needs to be a bit out of focus, just like the background. So let's duplicate this layer, add Gaussian blur. Maybe I'll go with 5 here and hit OK. I think we can go back to the previous layer and decrease its opacity down a bit. It looks much better. And finally, let's group all these layers into one folder, give it a proper name. At this stage, we're ready to go ahead and work on the remaining major elements in our scene, starting with the floating planet. I got this image in high quality from Envato Elements. Now usually whenever I need such an image, I spend a long time trying to find the right one online. The biggest challenge is to find something that matches the perspective of my scene and is easy to mask out, but not this time thanks to today's sponsor Envato Elements, which offers a huge library of stock images, graphic assets, motion templates, and pretty much everything you need to get creative projects done. Now my favorite category on Envato Elements is 3D objects. The 360-degree preview allows me to generate still images at any angle from 3D objects to get the perfect perspective that fits my scene. The frames are available to download in PNG with full transparency, which makes them ready to use and perfect to drop onto any composition with zero masking efforts. And that's exactly where I got most of the elements which I'll be using in this video. There are thousands of various 3D models on Envato Elements, which you can download instantly to use in your projects. Envato Elements hosts a massive library that features millions of creative digital assets, including high quality and royalty-free stock photos, sound effects, fonts, templates, and pretty much anything you need to speed up your workflow. You can download unlimited assets with just a single fee, which is really affordable and comes with a 50% off discount if you opt in for the yearly subscription. So make sure you check Envato Elements now using the link in the description box. Now back to Photoshop, let's enlarge and center the image up a bit. Slight rotation to the left. The image comes with a shadow effect by default, but I want to get rid of that. So add a layer mask and let's use the brush tool to get rid of the shadow. You can also shrink the image down around the bottom to make it seem as if the lifesaver is partially beneath the surface and covered by water. To recreate our own shadow effect, add an exposure layer, move it below the lifesaver layer, drop the exposure, select the layer mask, and using a small brush, restore some of the dark effect around the edges here. You can also add another level of soft shadows a bit further. Alright, nice. I actually want to replace the globe with a more realistic image of the Earth, and I have just the right graphic for that. Let's scale it up. You can also bring the layer's opacity down to have a better understanding of its size and position to make sure it matches the original globe right below it. It doesn't have to be perfect as long as it covers it entirely. I think this is good enough. Let's call this planet. The only remaining issue here is that the Earth is still outside the lifesaver, and to bring it in, let's add a layer mask, bring the opacity down for now, select the layer mask, and simply erase the part that overlaps with the lifesaver here. It does look good, but we still need some sort of a shadow effect here, so let's add a new exposure layer on top, create a clipping mask, adjust the properties for a much darker look. With the mask selected, press Ctrl I to invert it, and using a soft brush, let's restore some of that dark effect around the bottom here. Bring the brush opacity down and simply add another level of soft shadows a bit further for a feathered effect. Great, it looks much more convincing right now. So first let's group all three layers in one folder. I want to adjust the colors first thing, so add a hue and saturation adjustment layer, create a clipping mask, bump up the saturation, decrease the lightness a tiny bit, switch over to blue. Let's slide the hue over here. Once again, bump up the saturation and bring the lightness down. Okay, what else? I think it's a bit too bright, so let's add an exposure layer. Create a clipping mask, bring the exposure down, adjust the offset and the gamma. Next, add a brightness and contrast adjustment layer. Bring the brightness down. Let's add some contrast. Let's not forget to create a clipping mask here so this adjustment doesn't affect everything that's below it. I think this looks much better right now, although we have a few more adjustments to do. And since we have an intense firelight coming from the background, creating edge highlights is pretty crucial in order to nicely fit the main elements within the rest of the scene and achieve a higher level of realism. So let's add a new hue and saturation layer, create a clipping mask. I'm gonna call this one orange highlights. This time enable colorize, change the hue to orange, increase the saturation, bring the lightness down, change the blend mode to linear dodge, invert the layer mask, select the brush tool, and simply paint around the edges of the Earth as well as the lifesaver. We can emphasize on the effect a bit more by adding an exposure layer. Create a clipping mask, bring the exposure up. With the brush tool selected, press X to swap over to black as your foreground color, and simply erase some of the exposure effects around the center to intensify the highlights around the edges. I think this looks much better. We don't need to overdo it here, so let's keep it subtle. I'm gonna add another exposure layer on top here, and as usual, create a clipping mask. Let's call this darken, drop the exposure down, invert the mask. This time, I'm gonna use this layer to darken the bottom part of the lifesaver to create a shadow effect closer to the water surface. I think we can darken this a bit more. Alright, I'm happy with how it looks so far. And moving on, let's add a bit of a dreamy effect here by creating a blue glow on the earth itself. So add a hue layer, enable colorize, slide the hue towards blue, bump up the saturation. Maybe I'll drop the lightness a tiny bit. Let's invert the mask, make sure the brush is slightly bigger than the earth, and simply restore the adjustment effect on top. Let's drop the brush opacity a bit and apply the same effect on the lifesaver, and finally change the blend mode to screen. Perfect. Let's select all these layers together now and group them in one folder. I'm happy with how the earth part looks like. It blends well with the environment. So let's move on to work on the astronaut now. Import the image, place it over the earth. Personally, I'd like to have the astronaut look the other way. So let's go to edit, transform, and choose flip horizontal. Let's move it back to the center. Obviously, we need to mask out the environment, and we can get a quick assistance from Photoshop by going to select, subject. The selection is not perfect as you can see, but we can always use the quick selection tool to refine it. Press Alt to be able to remove unwanted areas, or simply paint around to add to your selection. Once you're happy with the outcome, simply click on Add Layer Mask, and with the mask selected, you can still refine the selection further. Let's get rid of the pigeon here and use the brush tool to refine the edges as well. There are certain parts that are sticking out here that we can get rid of to have less distractions around the astronaut. Other than that, I think we still need to adjust the position a bit more. So press on Ctrl T to transform, rotate it a bit. Cool, I think that's better. As you can see, the reflection on the astronaut's helmet doesn't match the current scene. I think it makes more sense if we have a reflection of the water surface instead. So let's bring in the same sea image once again. This time rotate it upside down. Let's place it over here, bring the opacity down, switch over to the pen tool, and simply draw a mask around the original face shield. Next, let's go all the way on top here and click on mask, bring the opacity back up to 100. I want to add a bit of distortion to it, so let's go to filter, liquify, and now you should be able to see a window similar to this one where you can adjust the liquify properties. Select the blow tool. These are the settings I'm going with, and I'm gonna use the liquify tool over here to distort the water. Might take a few clicks to get the right look, and once you're done, click on OK. I think that looks good enough, except for the color, of course. So press Ctrl U to adjust that. Change the hue to orange. Let's desaturate the image. Bring the lightness down. I think it still looks a bit off, so let's try to increase the saturation, or maybe I'll try to change the hue to blue instead. I think it looked better with less saturation. Okay, cool. You can always experiment with different properties here until you're happy with the outcome. Let's confirm this and finally group both layers in one folder. The astronaut still appears as if it's floating above the earth, and the best way to fix that is by adding shadows. So let's create a new blank layer, move it over below the astronaut's folder, and with the color set to black, use a small brush to paint dark shadows on the contact areas. Increase the size of the brush a bit and paint one more time around the same area for a softer look. It might be a bit too dark, so let's try bringing the opacity down. Okay, much better. And now we can focus on matching the colors to the rest of the scene. So back to the Astros folder, add a hue layer on top, create a clipping mask, slide the hue all the way to orange, add some saturation, reduce the lightness, switch to blues, decrease the saturation. Now let's add a levels adjustment layer, adjust the midtones, create a clipping mask, and let's bring the white output down. We definitely need to add some more highlights here as well, so let's add another hue and saturation layer, create a clipping mask, enable colorize, match the hue to that of the fire in the background, increase both saturation and lightness, Next, change the blend mode to screen, invert the mask, and with both the mask and brush tool selected, let's add some highlights all around the astronaut's edges here. I think it would be better to add some more saturation here. Maybe I'll add a bit of highlights here as well. Now remember, the Earth is glowing too, and some of the blue light coming out of it should cause some blue highlights, at least around the astronaut's legs. So add a new hue and saturation adjustment layer on top, create a clip-in mask, enable colorize. Let's go with blue this time. Bump up the saturation, change the blend mode to screen. Let's call this blue highlights. Invert the mask and restore the blue highlight effect around the edges that are closest to the Earth here. Cool. Now the surroundings have a bit of a faded look, so let's apply that on the astronaut as well. Add an exposure layer, create a clip-in mask, increase the exposure a tiny bit, adjust the offset as well as the gamma, just like that. And I think we can make this a bit more dramatic by adding some flare on the helmet. So create a new layer. If you're a frequent viewer of my videos, you probably know how much I like this brush pack from VisualforJulius. Let's select this flare brush, set the color to bright orange, and simply paint a flare somewhere around the edges of the shield here. And to blend it a bit better, change the blend mode to linear dodge. Cool. Now let's group all these layers in one folder. I'm gonna call it Astro plus Globe. We should be able to see a bit of reflection on the water surface here. So press Ctrl J to duplicate the folder, right click and convert it to a smart object. Let's call this reflection, then go to Edit, Transform, and click on Flip Vertical to mirror the layer. Slide it down below. Let's bring the reflection layer below the astronaut and then go to Effect, Distort, and Apply Wave. You can simply copy my settings or play around with the properties until you have the right look depending on your subject and the type of water surface you have in your artwork. Let's confirm this. Finally, change the blend mode to overlay. I think it is a bit too intense, so let's change the opacity to 33%. Press Ctrl U to pull up hue properties and bring the lightness down. And finally add some Gaussian blur. I think I'll go with 3.8 or so and apply. Looks pretty good. And moving on, let's go all the way to the background folder. I want to work on adding a bit more details that can help tell a stronger story here. So let's drag this comet image over to our project. First, change the blend mode to color dodge, press Ctrl U on your keyboard and change the hue to match the bright orange color in the background. Add a bit of saturation, increase the lightness. Obviously, we still need to feather the edges of the comet image a bit, so add a layer mask, switch back to the default brush, make sure the foreground color is set to black, and simply erase around the comet to feather the edges and blend it better with the sky. I think I overdid it around the tip here, so let's press X to swap the foreground color back to white and restore the comet's opacity. Great, it's pretty far in the distance, so let's add a Gaussian blur, set it to 7 or so. Cool. As you might have guessed, the next step here is to duplicate the comet into multiple layers that we can distribute around the background. You can add as many as you want, and you can always adjust each comet's size to create a bit of depth and randomness. Okay, I think the composition looks great so far. I don't think we need to add any more elements, so let's focus on color grading. Let's go all the way on top, add curves, create a subtle S-curve to add some contrast, and lift the shadows for a faded look. Now switch to blue. Adjust the curve slightly to add a bit of a bluish tint, just like that. I think the image is a bit too dark still, so let's add an exposure layer, increase the exposure. It looks much better now. Add a hue and saturation layer this time, increase the saturation, switch to yellows, adjust it to bump up the orange levels in the background. Switch over to Science, adjust the hue a bit. Let's check blues, adjust the hue here as well. Let's add a bit of saturation. Cool, I think the hue and saturation part is done. Finally, let's add another curves layer, darken the overall image. I'm gonna call this one Vignette, select the layer mask and simply erase the curves effect from the center to keep the darkness around the corners and edges to add a bit more dimension to the scene. And with these last touches, we come to the end of this tutorial. So thank you for sticking around. If you did enjoy this video, then don't forget to give it a like. And if you're into making digital art, motion graphics, visual effects, or simply enjoy making videos, make sure you subscribe, as I have a couple of really fun projects lined up for you guys. Other than that, stay creative and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.